In every prison, there's an unspoken line that separates those who wear the uniform from the inmates behind bars. But when the line is crossed, the consequences can be far-reaching. This is a story of a prison guard who, in a moment of weakness, crossed that line and slept with a young inmate. When the truth came to light, both of their lives were turned upside down, and what followed would be a lesson in regret, betrayal, and the consequences of breaking the rules. The prison guard, Jessica, had worked in the system for years. She had seen the worst of humanity, dealt with hardened criminals and the most unpredictable situations. Her days followed a rigid schedule. She arrived on time, did her rounds, enforced the rules, and never allowed her emotions to get in the way of her duties. She wore the uniform like armor, shielding herself from the undercurrents of empathy that might have otherwise complicated her job. But over the years, Jessica had become weary. She had started to question the lives she was living and the one she was enforcing behind these walls. It wasn't that she wasn't capable of caring. In fact, she cared deeply, just not in ways that showed. She had a soft spot for people who, like her, seemed to be stuck in life's grip. She saw herself in the inmates, those who made one bad choice and found themselves on a slippery slope, sinking deeper into a life of regret. She saw their pain reflected in their eyes, and sometimes it was hard to shake the feeling that they were just as trapped as she was. One inmate, in particular, had begun to consume her thoughts more than she cared to admit. His name was Luke. He was a young man, barely 22 years old, but he looked like he had lived a lifetime in the time he'd spent behind bars. His hair was dark and unkempt, his face hard, and yet somehow still boyish, with eyes that seemed older than his years. He had been incarcerated for a string of juvenile crimes, petty theft, assault, but something about him made Jessica wonder if he was more than the sum of his offenses. At first, Jessica had brushed off her thoughts about him. Inmates were just that, criminals who had to be kept in line. But Luke's vulnerability had caught her off guard. He wasn't like the other inmates who tried to intimidate or manipulate their way through the system. He had a quiet strength about him, a kind of sadness that pulled her in, and despite herself, Jessica found herself looking forward to their brief interactions. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, on the walls she'd built around her emotions. But Luke's presence was different. It wasn't just his eyes, though they often seemed to speak to her in ways words couldn't. It was the way he carried himself, a mix of bravado and fragility. She could see the conflict in him, as if he were trying to escape from the grip of a past he couldn't shake off. The first time they spoke, it was brief, an offhand comment about the cold weather. They stood there in silence for a moment, and Jessica had seen the flicker of recognition in his gaze, as though he saw something in her that he hadn't expected. A guard, but not just any guard, someone who might understand the weight he carried. And then there was that smile. It wasn't a smile of a man who had everything together. It was a sad, rueful smile that left her heart heavier than it had been before. Over time, their exchanges became more frequent, though still casual. He'd make small talk as she passed by, a fleeting moment of connection that made her forget, just for a second, that she was a guard and he was an inmate. Those moments, though rare, felt like a lifeline in her otherwise monotonous days. She caught herself thinking about him more than she cared to admit, wondering what he was thinking behind those quiet eyes, what his life had been like before he landed here. But Jessica didn't cross any lines. She kept her professionalism intact. That was until the night things began to unravel. It was a particularly cold evening. The prison, usually alive with noise and tension, felt empty. The inmates had settled down for the night, and the guards were finishing their rounds. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows along the cold, sterile hallways. Jessica's shift had been uneventful until she found herself near Luke's cell. She had been walking past, lost in thought, when she heard the sound of movement behind the bars. She turned to see Luke standing there, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity she hadn't seen before. He wasn't saying anything, just looking at her. There was something about the silence, the way he held her gaze, that made her heart race. It was as though the walls between them had suddenly grown thin. And in that moment, Jessica realized how much she had allowed herself to feel. Luke took a step closer to the bars. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You okay, guard?" It was a question that had no business being asked. She was the one in control, the one who was supposed to be the authority, but the way he asked it, with genuine concern, made her pause. She could feel her breath catch in her throat. For a moment she was speechless, unsure of how to respond. "Just tired," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Long shift." There was a brief silence before Luke spoke again, his tone lighter now. "Yeah, I get that. I used to be a night owl myself." Jessica didn't know why, but she found herself smiling at that. It was a simple exchange, but it felt like something more. She had to remind herself that he was an inmate. He had no right to ask her about her life, let alone care. But the connection was undeniable, and before she knew it, they were talking as though they were two people who had known each other for years, rather than someone in a uniform and someone behind bars. It wasn't until much later that she realized what had happened. The conversation had shifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly, from casual chat to something deeper, something more personal. She hadn't meant for it to go this way. She hadn't meant for it to happen at all, but somewhere along the line they had crossed a line. One look led to another, and before she knew it, she found herself in his cell. It was a quiet, empty space, the air thick with tension. Neither of them spoke, but the silence screamed. Luke was close now, so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. For a brief moment, they simply stood there, neither one making the first move. But the unspoken desire that hung in the air was undeniable. The decision was made without words. It was impulsive, reckless. But in that moment, neither of them cared. They both gave in to something they couldn't control. Their actions were driven by an uncontrollable pull, a force they couldn't resist. Afterwards, when the fog of their actions began to lift, the weight of what they had done came crashing down on Jessica. The professional walls she had so carefully built shattered in an instant, and she was left with the reality of the consequences. Regret flooded her heart, but it was too late. What had been a momentary lapse in judgment had changed everything. The line they had crossed would never be uncrossed, and the repercussions would be far greater than either of them had anticipated. The truth always comes out, and when it did, it came crashing down on both of them with the force of a tidal wave. The prison, with its carefully constructed walls of discipline, routine, and order, was rocked to its very core. Inmates whispered about what had happened, guards exchanged knowing glances, and the atmosphere in the prison seemed to thicken, like something dark and dangerous was about to engulf them all. Jessica had known, in the pit of her stomach, that it was only a matter of time before someone found out. She'd tried to push the memories of that night out of her mind, to convince herself that it was just a fleeting lapse in judgment. She'd tried to tell herself that it meant nothing, that it was just a momentary escape from the pressures of a life she had long grown numb to. But the truth was, it meant everything. And the consequences of their actions were far-reaching, something neither of them could have fully understood at the time. The night after their encounter, Jessica didn't sleep. She stayed awake, tossing and turning in her bed, the weight of her decision heavy on her chest. The sound of Luke's voice, the touch of his skin, haunted her thoughts, repeating over and over again in a never-ending loop. She tried to rationalize it, to make sense of it, but there was no way to justify what they had done. She knew the rules, she knew the stakes, and yet, in the heat of the moment, all of that had disappeared. But as the days passed, reality began to sink in. The first crack in the dam came when she saw the way the other guards looked at her. Their eyes were different now, tinged with suspicion, like they knew something she didn't. Some tried to avoid her, while others gave her half-hearted greetings. She had always been the steady one, the one they could rely on, but now she felt like an outsider in her own world. It wasn't until the incident was reported by an inmate, one who had seen more than he should have, that everything unraveled. The prisoner had been part of the population that witnessed the entire event, and instead of keeping his silence, he'd been too eager to share the details. He wasn't trying to be a hero or do the right thing. He simply saw an opportunity to leverage the situation for his own gain. Prisoners like him were always looking for ways to stir trouble, and in this case, he'd found the perfect leverage. The guards were the first to hear about it. A fellow officer, a close colleague of Jessica's, had gotten wind of the rumors and pulled her aside during her shift. "You need to be careful," he said, his voice hushed. "There's word going around about you and Luke. People are talking." Jessica's stomach dropped. It was as if the world around her had stopped moving, and for a brief moment, she couldn't hear anything but the rush of blood in her ears. She had to swallow hard to keep herself from panicking. "Who knows?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know yet," he said, his face a mixture of concern and disbelief. "But you need to be prepared. If this gets out, it's not going to be good for you." Her mind raced. She had always known that the consequences for something like this would be severe, but the weight of hearing it out loud from someone she trusted made it feel all the more real. What had started as a moment of weakness was now spiraling out of control. She had crossed the line, and there was no undoing it. The cold realization that her career and her life could be destroyed by this one mistake settled in her bones. For the rest of the day, Jessica walked around in a daze. She had to pretend to do her job, to maintain some semblance of control, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Luke. Where was he now? What was he thinking? Was he as terrified as she was? Would he be the one to come forward and reveal everything, or would he stay silent, letting the rumors run their course? It wasn't long before the truth came out. One by one, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Luke had been caught and speaking to another inmate about the night they shared. And while he hadn't been explicit about the details, it was clear enough that the word had spread. The story was already out there, twisted and turned into something far worse than it had been in reality. The other inmates saw an opportunity to exploit the situation. They fed on the chaos, making sure to keep the rumor mill churning. By the time the prison administration got involved, there was no stopping the fallout. Jessica was called into a meeting with the warden. The room was sterile, the air thick with tension. She sat across from him, her palms sweating, trying to keep herself composed, but it was hard to look him in the eye, knowing what she had done. "You've been accused of inappropriate conduct with an inmate," the warden said flatly. His words were cold, calculated. He didn't even look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the paper in front of him. "Is there any truth to these accusations?" Jessica wanted to speak. She wanted to tell him everything, to explain how it had happened, to beg for understanding. But she couldn't. The words felt like they were stuck in her throat, too heavy to form. Instead, she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that was enough to confirm everything. "You understand the gravity of this, don't you?" the warden continued. "This is a serious violation of policy, of trust, and it puts the entire security of this facility at risk." She could only nod again. She had known the risks. She had always known what could happen if she let her emotions get in the way, but it didn't change the fact that she had betrayed everything she stood for. And now, she was going to pay the price. As the meeting ended, Jessica was escorted from the room. She felt numb, like she was moving through a fog. The walls of the prison, once familiar and secure, now seemed to close in on her. She was no longer the steady, reliable guard she had once been. She was a pariah, shunned, judged, and left to face the consequences of her own actions. And as the days passed, the full weight of her mistake settled in. She had lost her career, her reputation, and her dignity. The prison, which had once been her home and her livelihood, was now a place that no longer felt safe. Her life had been irrevocably altered, and all because of one night, a night that had started with a single moment of weakness and ended in a devastating, irreversible collapse. The consequences of Jessica's actions continued to unfold with an unforgiving speed. In the weeks following the revelation, everything she had worked for, the career she had spent years building, the respect she had earned among her peers, and even the small sense of pride she had carried with her in the face of adversity, began to crumble like dry sand slipping through her fingers. What had once seemed like a momentary lapse in judgment was now a full-blown crisis, and she had no idea how to stop the avalanche that was threatening to consume her. The first few days after the meeting with the warden were a blur. Jessica had been placed on administrative leave, her access to the facility revoked, and her badge taken away. She was left to sit at home, trapped in her own thoughts, replaying the events over and over again in her mind. She couldn't shake the guilt, the shame, the crushing realization that she had made a mistake so severe it had brought down everything she had worked for. Her phone had become a lifeline, though it felt like a curse in disguise. Friends and colleagues who had once been her trusted allies now avoided her calls. The once comforting hum of social media became a constant reminder of the life she had lost. People who had once admired her for her professionalism now turned their backs. Her inbox was filled with the messages, some from people who claimed to want to help, others from those who simply wanted to know every sordid detail of what had happened. But what struck her most was the silence from Luke. She had expected him to reach out, to say something, but nothing. Not a single word. The uncertainty of his silence gnawed at her, and she found herself becoming more consumed by the absence of any communication from him than by the scandal itself. Had he regretted it as much as she did? Had he forgotten her already? Or was he suffering in the same way, silently struggling with the weight of their actions? It was on one particularly sleepless night that Jessica finally picked up the phone. She hesitated for a moment, then dialed the number of an old friend from outside the prison system, a counselor she had known for years. They had met once at a seminar on mental health and had stayed in touch ever since. The counselor, named Laura, had always been a voice of reason for Jessica, someone who could provide clarity when everything felt like a whirlwind. When the phone clicked, Laura's voice came through, warm and steady. "Jessica, it's been a while. How are you holding up?" Jessica's throat tightened. She wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was, she wasn't holding up. She had spent the past few weeks wrapped in a fog of regret, struggling to breathe under the weight of everything she had lost. Her career, her dignity, and the life she had once known all seemed so far out of reach. "I don't know how to do this, Laura," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this. I feel like everything is falling apart." Laura's voice softened with sympathy. "You made a mistake, Jessica. But that doesn't mean it defines who you are. You still have a choice in how this plays out. It's going to be hard, but you can rebuild. It's not the end of the world, even though it feels like it right now." "But it feels like it is the end," Jessica admitted. "I don't know if I can ever go back to the person I was. I don't know if I can ever go back to being the person I thought I was. I crossed a line I can never uncross." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Jessica thought Laura might say something to reassure her. Instead, Laura's voice became more serious. "You're right. You can't undo what happened, but you can choose to learn from it, and that's where you have control. There's a way forward from this, but it starts with you accepting what happened, taking responsibility, and figuring out who you want to be moving forward. It's not about erasing your past. It's about what you do with your future." Her words struck Jessica deeply, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope, even if only a little. Maybe she hadn't lost everything. Maybe she could rebuild one step at a time. But it wasn't going to be easy. As the days went by, Jessica found herself facing a new, more personal challenge: the public fallout. The story of her involvement with Luke had become a spectacle. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, her personal life was no longer private. She was portrayed as a villain in the media, her actions reduced to something simple, something black and white. The reports painted her as just another corrupt guard who had abused her power. They didn't tell the whole story, the context, the complexity, the fact that it was a human mistake, not a calculated crime. But that didn't matter. The story was out there, and now she had to deal with the fallout. The first time she walked outside after the story broke, she felt like the whole world was watching her. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, judgment in their stares. They didn't know the full truth, but it didn't matter. To them, she was just another headline, another cautionary tale. It was a gut-wrenching feeling, knowing that her name was being dragged through the mud by people who didn't know her, didn't understand the nuances of what had happened. She wasn't some villain who deserved to be vilified, but in the court of public opinion, there was no room for nuance. Her family had been no better. When her parents found out, their disappointment was palpable. They couldn't understand how their daughter, someone who had always been so steadfast and dedicated to her work, could have made such a catastrophic mistake. Her mother cried on the phone, asking if there was something they had missed in raising her. Her father, though more stoic, had a hard time looking her in the eye. They didn't know how to support her in a situation that seemed so cut and dried. The hardest part was the guilt she felt over what this had done to her family. They hadn't asked for this scandal, and now they were wrapped up in it too. It felt like her entire existence had become a burden on everyone she loved, and the weight of that guilt threatened to suffocate her at times. But through all of this, what kept Jessica going was the idea that she still had a chance to turn things around. She could rebuild her life. Slowly, cautiously, but surely. She could learn from her mistakes and find a way to make amends. But that wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, patience, and the willingness to confront herself in ways she hadn't before. The first step, she realized, was to stop running from the reality of what she had done. She couldn't erase the past, but she could face it head on, own up to it, and begin the long and painful process of making things right. The road ahead would be uncertain, and the scars from this experience would remain with her forever. But for the first time in a long time, Jessica felt a flicker of hope. She might not have known exactly what the future held, but at least now she had a choice in how to move forward. And that, in its own way, felt like a small victory. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, the kind of place where lives were reduced to legal arguments and where the past was dissected in agonizing detail. Jessica sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles were white. The fluorescent lighting cast a harsh glow over her face, making her look even more exhausted than she felt. She had barely slept in the weeks leading up to this day. Every moment had been spent reliving the choices that had brought her here, imagining the worst possible outcomes and bracing herself for the judgment that was about to be passed. Luke was there too, sitting on the other side of the courtroom. She had only seen him once since this entire nightmare had begun during a preliminary hearing, and even then, he hadn't looked at her. Today was no different. He sat with his shoulders tense, his expression unreadable. She wanted to know what he was thinking. If he resented her, if he regretted everything as much as she did, or if he had somehow managed to convince himself that none of it had ever really mattered. But there was no way to tell. The boy she had known inside the prison, the one who had looked at her with admiration and affection, was gone. Now, he was just another figure in this mess, another person caught in the crossfire. The prosecution wasted no time in painting Jessica as a predator, a manipulator who had taken advantage of a vulnerable young man. They spoke about power imbalances, about duty and trust, and about how she had violated not just the law, but the very moral foundation that allowed society to function. The words cut deep, not because they were all true, but because they weren't entirely false either. She had been reckless, blinded by emotion, caught in something that had spiraled far beyond her control. But had she really been the cold, calculating woman they were describing? Had she really set out to ruin Luke's life? The idea was almost laughable, but it didn't matter. Perception was everything now, and to the court, she was nothing more than a villain in a story that had already been written. Her lawyer did what he could to present a different side of the story. He spoke about Jessica's years of dedication, about her spotless record before this incident, about how she had not used force or coercion. He argued that while her actions had been wrong, they had not been malicious. She had made a mistake, an inexcusable one, yes, but a mistake nonetheless. He painted her as a flawed human being, not a monster. But as she sat there listening, she wasn't sure if anyone in that room really cared about the difference. The moment of truth came when Luke was called to the stand. Jessica held her breath as he walked up, every step feeling like a weight pressing down on her chest. He looked different, older somehow, more hardened. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but she could hear the strain beneath the surface. "I never felt forced," he said. "She didn't make me do anything I didn't want to do." It was a simple statement, but it sent a ripple through the courtroom. The prosecutor quickly countered, pointing out that consent didn't matter when there was a clear power imbalance. Luke had been an inmate, Jessica a guard. It was black and white in the eyes of the law, but to Jessica it was more than that. She had wanted to believe that what they had shared had been real, that even if it had been a mistake, it had been something built on genuine connection. Now, she wasn't so sure. The sentencing hearing was even worse. The judge spoke about responsibility, about the trust that had been broken, and about the need to make an example out of cases like this. When the sentence was handed down, prison time, though less than the maximum, Jessica barely reacted. She had already known this was coming. What hurt more than the sentence itself was the knowledge that this was the final nail in the coffin of her old life. There was no coming back from this. She would be branded forever, her name synonymous with scandal. As she was led away, she allowed herself one last glance at Luke. He was watching her now, his expression unreadable. She wondered if he would forget her, if this would become just another chapter in his life that he would one day look back on with detachment. Maybe it was better that way. Maybe it was the only way they could both move on. Prison was a bitter irony, a cruel twist that made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. She was no longer a guard, no longer someone with power and authority. Now, she was just another inmate, another name on a list, another person lost in the system. The first few days were the hardest. The whispers followed her everywhere, the judgment in the eyes of the other prisoners cutting deeper than any insult. Some of them recognized her. They had seen her on the news, read the articles, passed around their own versions of the story. "Look who it is," one of the other inmates sneered. "Guess the tables turned, huh?" She didn't respond. There was no point. She had already lost everything. What was left to defend? The routine of prison life was monotonous, but in a way, it was also a relief. There was no room for overthinking, no space for regret. Everything was dictated by a schedule, meals, roll calls, work assignments. It was a new kind of existence, one stripped of all the ambitions and dreams she had once held. And maybe that was what she deserved. But even in the quietest moments, when she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about everything that had led her here. Had she been naive? Had she let loneliness cloud her judgment? Had she truly believed that she could build something meaningful with someone who had been just as lost as she was? She didn't know, and maybe she never would. What she did know was that this was her reality now. There were no more second chances, no more what-ifs. The only thing left was time. Time to reflect, time to accept, time to figure out who she would be when, if she ever walked out of those prison gates again.